The sky over the Hudson Valley was thick with storm clouds when the car crested the final hill, and there it was, Blackwood Manor. Even in the fading light of evening, the house seemed to absorb what little brightness remained in the world. Its dark, weathered stone and towering presence struck an eerie silhouette against the pale, churning sky. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat as the wind clawed at the bare branches around us, the sound like bony fingers scraping across slate. Jonny, as usual, was unbothered, his focus trained on the manor ahead. His hand rested casually on the steering wheel, his cigarette glowing faintly in the growing darkness. "Cheerful," I muttered, breaking the silence that had stretched between us for the better part of the drive. Jonny glanced at me, the corner of his mouth lifting in a wry smile. "What were you expecting, Evelyn? Sunshine and a welcome mat." I rolled my eyes but couldn't suppress the faint smile tugging at my own lips. A light in one of the windows wouldn't have killed anyone. Or perhaps it has, and that's why it's so dark. Jonny chuckled softly and took a drag of his cigarette before flicking it out the window. "You'll scare yourself before the ghosts get a chance to." If only his teasing could erase the apprehension curling in my stomach. But as we rolled to a stop at the base of the long gravel drive, the unease remained, growing heavier as I gazed up at the bricked-up windows staring back like blind, unseeing eyes. The Coopers were waiting for us just outside the front door, huddled together against the chill. Thomas Cooper stepped forward first, his broad-shouldered frame illuminated briefly by the headlights before Jonny killed the engine. Margaret and their daughter, Lucy, stood a few steps behind him, their figures stark against the backdrop of the darkened house. Jonny was out of the car before I'd even unbuckled, his trench coat flaring slightly in the wind as he moved to shake Thomas's hand. "Mr. Cooper." He greeted him in that steady, measured tone that always seemed to put people at ease. "Detective Hawthorne. And this is Dr. Evelyn Reed." I followed suit, smiling politely as I shook Thomas's hand. His grip was firm, but I could feel the tension in it, the barely contained anxiety that radiated from both him and his wife. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said, his voice low but earnest. We didn't know who else to turn to." Margaret stepped forward, clutching Lucy's hand tightly. "It's been unbearable," she said, her voice trembling. "The whispers, the shadows. And Lucy." Her voice broke, and she looked away, blinking rapidly. I crouched slightly to meet Lucy's gaze. The little girl clung to her mother's skirts, her wide eyes fixed on me with an intensity that was unsettling for a child her age. She was pale, her cheeks hollow as if she hadn't been eating well, and her dark hair hung limply around her face. "Hello, Lucy," I said gently. "I'm Evelyn. It's nice to meet you." She didn't respond, didn't even blink. Her tiny fingers gripped her doll tighter, and I noticed for the first time that one of the doll's button eyes was missing, leaving a dark, empty circle that mirrored the bricked-up windows above. "She hasn't spoken much since we moved in," Margaret explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonny's gaze flicked between the girl and her parents, his expression unreadable. "We'll do everything we can to help," he said, his tone firm but reassuring. Thomas nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he gestured toward the house. "Please come inside. It's cold out here." Cold was an understatement. The wind seemed to bite straight through my coat, and I was all too eager to step into the shelter of the house, ominous as it might be. The interior of Blackwood Manor was no more welcoming than its exterior. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay, and the faint echo of our footsteps on the wooden floorboards made the vast, empty space feel even more oppressive. Margaret lit a kerosene lamp, the warm glow casting flickering shadows across the walls. The electricity's been unreliable, she explained apologetically. We've had to rely on lamps like this. Jonny nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the room. What can you tell us about the disturbances you've experienced so far? Thomas ran a hand through his hair, clearly unsure where to begin. It started almost immediately after we moved in, he said finally. The whispers, they come at night, usually when we're trying to sleep. Sometimes they sound like they're coming from just outside the walls, other times from the next room. Margaret shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. And the shadows. We've seen them moving in the hallways, even when there's no one else in the house. Jonny exchanged a glance with me, his expression thoughtful. And the windows? Thomas hesitated before answering. They glow sometimes, faintly, like there's a light behind them. But when we go to check, there's nothing there. I felt a chill run down my spine, though I kept my face carefully neutral. Has anyone experienced anything physical? Cold spots? Objects moving? Anything like that? Margaret shook her head. No, not yet. But Lucy, her voice faltered, and she pulled her daughter closer. She keeps talking about a lady, says the lady is watching us. Jonny crouched slightly, his gaze level with Lucy's. Is that true, Lucy? Have you seen the lady? For the first time, the girl moved, her grip tightening on her doll as she nodded ever so slightly. What does she look like? Jonny asked gently. Lucy hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she turned and buried her face in her mother's skirts. Jonny straightened, his expression thoughtful. It's all right, he said, addressing both Lucy and her parents. We're here now, and we'll get to the bottom of this. Margaret managed a faint smile of gratitude, though it was clear the strain of the past few weeks was taking its toll on her. Thomas led us to the sitting room, where a fire was crackling weakly in the hearth. The flickering flames did little to dispel the gloom of the room, but it was warmer than the rest of the house, and for that I was grateful. Jonny and I settled into mismatched armchairs while the Coopers took the sofa. I pulled out my notebook, ready to jot down anything of significance, while Jonny leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he addressed the family. We'll need access to every part of the house, he said, even the attic and the basement, if possible. Thomas nodded. Of course, whatever you need. Good, Jonny said, his tone brisk. And I assume you have records of the property's history? Previous owners? Anything like that? Margaret shook her head. Not much, just what the real estate agent told us. The house belonged to the Blackwood family, but they all passed away under mysterious circumstances. Conveniently vague, I muttered under my breath, earning a faint smirk from Jonny. We'll look into it, he said, standing and brushing imaginary dust from his coat. For now, we'll start with a walkthrough of the house. Evelyn, I nodded, tucking my notebook back into my bag as I rose to join him. The Coopers watched us go, their expressions a mix of hope and trepidation. As we stepped back into the dim, silent hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was irrational, of course. There was no one else in the house but us and the Coopers. At least that's what I told myself. The stillness of the night seemed to press against the walls of Blackwood Manor as we began our initial walkthrough of the house. The flickering lamp Margaret had handed to Jonny cast trembling, uneven light onto the faded wallpaper and cracked woodwork, creating shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. A faint, cold draft trailed through the hallways, brushing against my skin like the lingering touch of unseen fingers. Jonny moved ahead of me, his footsteps deliberate and measured, each creak of the wooden floorboards announcing his progress through the darkened halls. He held the lamp high, the warm glow reflecting off his sharp features, illuminating the intense focus in his eyes. To anyone else, his expression might have seemed detached, but I could see the subtle signs of his curiosity at work, the slight furrow of his brow, the way his gaze lingered on certain details as though committing them to memory. "Charming place," I murmured, my voice low enough not to disrupt the heavy silence but loud enough to be heard. Jonny didn't look back, but I caught the faint twitch of his lips. "It has character," he replied, his tone dry. I trailed behind him, my eyes scanning the faded portraits that lined the walls. The faces were stern and joyless, each subject seemingly caught mid-glare as though chastising us for daring to intrude. The names beneath the portraits had faded with time, but the oppressive presence of the Blackwood family was undeniable. "What do you think they were like?" I asked, gesturing toward one particularly dour-looking patriarch. "Not the type to host dinner parties," Jonny replied without missing a beat. As we turned a corner into what appeared to be a drawing room, the air grew noticeably colder. The fireplace at the far end of the room was empty, its charred interior a stark contrast to the ornate marble frame that surrounded it. Dust coated every surface, and the furniture, covered in white sheets, looked like restless spirits frozen mid-motion. Jonny paused, his gaze fixed on the windowless wall to our left. 13 bricked-up windows," he said quietly, almost to himself. I followed his line of sight, my own curiosity piqued. The bricked-up rectangles were unervingly uniform, their mortar smooth and unbroken despite the obvious age of the house. I stepped closer, reaching out to run my fingers along the cold, rough surface. "Perfectly sealed," I noted. "No drafts, no cracks. It's almost as if they were designed to last forever." Jonny nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Or to keep something in." The suggestion sent a shiver down my spine, though I refused to let it show. "Logical as ever," I teased, though my voice lacked conviction. Jonny's only response was a slight tilt of his head, as if acknowledging a point yet to be proven. We moved deeper into the house, our journey marked by the steady creak of the floorboards and the faint hiss of the lamp's flame. The further we went, the more I felt the weight of the house pressing down on us, as though the very walls were leaning in to watch. Our exploration eventually led us to a narrow staircase, its wooden steps warped with age. Jonny held the lamp steady as we ascended, the light casting distorted shadows on the peeling wallpaper. At the top of the stairs, we found ourselves in a hallway lined with doors, each one closed and uninviting. Jonny hesitated for a moment before selecting a door at random. He pushed it open slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed frame pushed against one wall and a wardrobe standing sentinel in the corner. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of neglect. Lucy's room, I guessed, though the layer of dust suggested otherwise. Jonny shook his head. "Too much dust. This hasn't been used in years." He stepped inside, his sharp gaze taking in every detail, while I remained in the doorway, my arms folded against the cold. My eyes were drawn to a faint discoloration on the floorboards near the bed, an irregular patch darker than the surrounding wood. "Jonny," I said, nodding toward the spot. He crouched beside it, running his fingers over the surface. Stained, he confirmed. Blood, maybe. Hard to tell without testing. I swallowed hard, the chill in the room suddenly feeling much more pronounced. Lovely, I said dryly. Jonny stood, brushing the dust from his hands. Let's keep moving. We continued down the hallway, opening doors and peering into rooms that all seemed to share the same sense of abandonment. Each space felt more oppressive than the last, as though the house itself resented our presence. At the end of the hall, we found a door that stood slightly ajar. Jonny pushed it open with the tip of his shoe, revealing what appeared to be a study. Unlike the other rooms, this one showed signs of use, or at least it had been used more recently than the others. A desk sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers and books, while a single chair faced the windowless wall. Jonny approached the desk, his movements deliberate as he began sorting through the papers. I stayed near the door, my gaze drawn to the shelves that lined the walls. The books were old, their spines cracked and faded, but their titles hinted at an unusual collection. Texts on folklore, superstition, and the occult. Interesting reading material, I remarked, running my fingers along the spines. Jonny grunted in agreement, holding up a yellowed piece of paper covered in cramped handwriting. Looks like the previous owner kept meticulous notes, he said, scanning the page. On what? I asked, stepping closer. Jonny's brow furrowed as he read. Rituals, mostly. Summoning, binding, warding, you name it. A sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. Charming hobby, I muttered. Jonny set the paper aside, his expression unreadable. It's too soon to jump to conclusions, but this might explain some of what's happening here. I nodded, though the explanation did little to ease the tension coiling in my chest. The thought of someone deliberately invoking or attempting to bind something within the walls of this house was unsettling, to say the least. As we left the study and made our way back downstairs, the silence of the house felt heavier than before, as though it had been disturbed by our prying. The faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet seemed louder, more accusatory, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Jonny, as always, was unflappable, his stride steady and his expression calm. But even he paused at the bottom of the stairs, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to pool around the edges of the hallway. Something's not right, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. Before I could respond, a sudden sound broke the silence. A faint, high-pitched laugh, as though a child were giggling in the distance. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as the sound echoed faintly through the hall. Jonny's hand moved instinctively to the pocket where he kept his flashlight, his body tense and alert. "Lucy," I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. There was no response, only the oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Jonny gestured for me to stay close as he moved toward the source of the sound, the lamp held high to cut through the shadows. I followed him, my pulse pounding in my ears as we approached a doorway at the end of the hall. The room beyond was empty, its only occupant a large, dust-covered mirror propped against the far wall. The glass was cracked, the fractures spiderwebbing across its surface like veins of ice. Jonny stepped closer, his gaze narrowing as he inspected the mirror. "Nothing," he said, his voice clipped. I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the chilly air. "Let's hope it stays that way," I murmured. But as we turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks in the mirror were watching us, their jagged edges glinting like teeth in the flickering light. The echoes of our footsteps seemed to stretch infinitely through the desolate corridors of Blackwood Manor. The faint memory of that childlike laugh still lingered in my mind, weaving an almost tangible thread of tension in the air. I had always prided myself on being grounded, a person of reason and science, but something about this house tested my limits. It pressed against my psyche in ways I was reluctant to admit. Jonny, of course, was unshaken. He pressed forward with the deliberate, measured steps of a man who trusted in his methods more than the whispers of the supernatural. His trench coat swayed faintly as he led us back to the main hallway, his silhouette framed by the wavering lamplight he carried. "You're quiet," he said without looking back. "Just observing," I replied, though the strain in my voice betrayed the unease I'd been working hard to suppress. Jonny turned his head slightly, casting me a sidelong glance. Observing or overthinking? Maybe both. He smirked faintly, the kind of smirk that managed to be both teasing and understanding. "Good. Keeps you sharp." We found ourselves back in the sitting room where the Coopers had gathered before retiring to their rooms for the night. The fire had long since faded, leaving the room cold and shadowed. I wrapped my arms around myself as I followed Jonny to the mantelpiece, where he set the lamp down and began rifling through the papers Thomas Cooper had left behind. "What are you looking for?" I asked, watching as he sorted the documents with practiced efficiency. "Anything that fills in the blanks," he said, his voice distracted but focused. "Deeds, records, letters. Something that gives us a clearer picture of who lived here and why." I moved to the bookshelf on the far wall, my fingers trailing along the spines of the dusty tomes. Most were what I'd expect from an old manor, faded volumes on history, literature, and the occasional treatise on business and economics. But one caught my eye, its cover darker than the rest and devoid of a title. "Jonny," I called softly, pulling the book from its place. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed the volume in my hands. "What is it?" I opened the book carefully, the brittle pages crackling faintly as I flipped through them. It wasn't a novel or a history text, but a collection of handwritten notes, diagrams, and what appeared to be spells or rituals. The language was a mixture of Latin, English, and something else I couldn't identify, something jagged and unfamiliar that made my skin crawl just to look at. "This doesn't feel like light reading," I said, showing Jonny the book. He took it from me, his expression hardening as he scanned the pages. "It's not," he agreed, closing the book with a decisive snap. "We'll need to go through this carefully later. For now, let's focus on the house." Reluctantly, I placed the book on the desk, its ominous presence a silent reminder of the mysteries we were trying to unravel. "Where to next?" I asked, straightening my coat against the persistent chill. Jonny considered for a moment before nodding toward the hallway. "The basement. If there's anything to hide, that's where I'd put it." I couldn't argue with his logic, though the prospect of descending into the bowels of this house was far from appealing. Still, I followed him without hesitation, the lamp casting long, flickering shadows on the walls as we made our way to the basement door. The door itself was unremarkable, simple, wooden, and slightly warped with age, but the air around it felt heavier, as though the very house was warning us against going further. Jonny didn't hesitate, his hand steady as he turned the knob and pulled the door open. The staircase beyond was steep and narrow, the steps creaking ominously under our weight as we descended into the darkness. The cold grew sharper with each step, biting at my skin and sinking into my bones. By the time we reached the bottom, I was certain I could see my breath fogging in the dim light. The basement was larger than I had expected, its low ceiling supported by thick wooden beams that cast long, sinister shadows across the dirt floor. The air was damp and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and unsettling. Jonny held the lamp high, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. "Don't have to tell me twice," I muttered, my own voice barely above a whisper. We moved carefully through the space, our footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath us. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of various sizes, their contents obscured by grime and time. One jar caught my eye, its lid cracked and its contents a dark, viscous liquid that clung to the glass like tar. "Lovely," I remarked, my tone flat as I pointed it out to Jonny. He glanced at it briefly before turning his attention to a heavy wooden chest pushed against the far wall. "Help me with this," he said, setting the lamp down nearby. I joined him, my hands gripping the rough edges of the chest as we heaved it open. The hinges protested loudly, the sound echoing through the basement like a scream. Inside, we found an assortment of items: old photographs, letters, and what appeared to be a small, intricately carved box. Jonny reached for the box first, his movements careful as he lifted it from the chest and examined it closely. The carvings were strange, abstract yet deliberate, as though they held some meaning we couldn't immediately decipher. "What do you make of it?" I asked, leaning in to get a better look. "Too early to say," Jonny replied, though his tone suggested he already had a few theories forming. He set the box aside and began sorting through the photographs and letters. Many of the images were faded, the faces of the people barely discernible, but one stood out: a portrait of a woman with dark eyes and an expression that seemed both sorrowful and accusatory. "Eleanor Blackwood," Jonny said, holding up the photograph. "The last owner?" I asked, my brow furrowing. He nodded, his gaze lingering on the image. "And the one who had all the windows bricked up." The weight of his words settled over us like a thick fog. Whatever had driven Eleanor Blackwood to such drastic measures, it was clear she had been trying to keep something at bay. As we continued to sift through the items, a sudden noise broke the oppressive silence. A faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from the far corner of the basement. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I glanced toward the source of the sound. Jonny was already on his feet, the lamp in his hand as he moved toward the corner with deliberate, measured steps. I followed closely, my heart pounding in my chest as the tapping grew louder, more insistent. When we reached the corner, we found nothing but a large, empty barrel and a pile of rotting wood. Jonny crouched down, his sharp eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. "Anything?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Jonny shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Could be the house settling," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I nodded, though the explanation did little to ease the knot of tension in my chest. As we made our way back up the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were leaving something, or someone, behind in the shadows of the basement. Once we were back in the relative safety of the main floor, Jonny set the lamp down on the dining room table and began examining the carved box more closely. I watched as his fingers traced the intricate patterns, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What's your theory?" I asked, breaking the silence. Jonny glanced at me, his expression serious. "This house has secrets," he said simply, "and whatever Eleanor Blackwood was trying to hide, I don't think it stayed hidden." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling heavily in my chest. As much as I wanted to dismiss his suspicions as paranoia, a part of me knew he was right. Blackwood Manor was more than just an old house with a tragic history. It was a puzzle, one we were only beginning to piece together. The morning sunlight fought a losing battle with the thick, overcast sky as I stepped into the kitchen. It was an austere space, dimly lit and poorly insulated, with creaking floorboards that gave the impression of being watched with every step. The Coopers had opted to sleep upstairs, or so they said, though judging by the haggard expressions they wore when we joined them at the breakfast table, it seemed the family had barely closed their eyes. Margaret sat stiffly, her hands resting on the worn tabletop as she stirred her tea with a mechanical motion, barely looking up when Jonny and I entered. Thomas glanced our way with a nod of acknowledgement, but his expression betrayed the weight of worry that clung to him like an old coat. Lucy, however, was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Lucy?" Jonny asked casually, though his keen eyes missed nothing. Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the door that led to the backyard. "She wanted to play outside," she said, her voice quiet but strained. She said she felt better in the fresh air." Johnny's lips pressed into a thin line as he exchanged a glance with me. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the back door, his coat brushing the edges of the narrow doorway as he stepped out into the gray morning. I lingered for a moment, my attention shifting back to Margaret. "Are you all right?" I asked gently, lowering myself into the chair across from her. Her grip on the teacup tightened, the delicate porcelain trembling slightly in her hands. "Do you think we're imagining it?" she asked suddenly, her voice raw with desperation. "The whispers, the shadows. Do you think we're losing our minds?" I paused, carefully considering my response. "Stress can do strange things to a person," I said finally, keeping my tone measured. "But that doesn't mean what you're experiencing isn't real." Margaret nodded slowly, though her expression remained distant. Before I could say more, the sound of Johnny's voice reached us from the backyard. I excused myself and followed the sound, stepping out into the cool, damp air. Jonny was standing near the edge of the garden, his hands in his pockets as he spoke with Lucy, who was crouched in the grass, picking at a small cluster of wildflowers. Her doll was lying nearby, half buried in the damp earth. "Morning," I said, offering a small smile as I approached. Lucy glanced up briefly but said nothing, her focus returning quickly to the flowers in her hand. "She says the lady doesn't like us being in the house," Jonny said, his tone conversational but edged with an undertone I couldn't quite place. I crouched beside Lucy, tilting my head to meet her gaze. "The lady," I said gently. "Does she talk to you?" Lucy shook her head, her dark eyes fixed on the flowers as she threaded them together into a loose chain. "No," she said quietly, "but I can feel her. She's angry." "Angry about what?" I prompted, careful to keep my tone calm and non-threatening. Lucy hesitated, her small fingers pausing mid-motion. "She doesn't like it when we go into the rooms with no windows," she said finally. Johnny's eyes met mine, his expression thoughtful. "The bricked-up rooms," he said simply. I nodded, straightening as Lucy continued to weave her flowers together in silence. Whatever was happening in this house, it was clear that Lucy was more attuned to it than anyone else. We left her in the garden under Thomas's watchful eye and returned to the manor, the oppressive atmosphere of the house closing in around us once more. "Where do you want to start?" I asked as we stepped into the dim hallway. Jonny paused, his gaze drifting toward the staircase that led to the upper floors. "The study," he said finally. "We need to take another look at that book." I nodded, following him as he ascended the stairs, the floorboards groaning under our weight. The air grew colder as we climbed, each step feeling like a descent into something darker despite our upward direction. The study was just as we'd left it, the shadows clinging to the corners as the weak light from the overcast sky filtered through the single unbricked window. The book lay on the desk where we'd placed it the night before, its dark cover unassuming but laden with a presence that seemed to command the room. Jonny picked it up without hesitation, his sharp eyes scanning the pages as he turned them one by one. His expression remained impassive, but I could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the faint crease in his brow that betrayed his thoughts. "What do you make of it?" I asked, leaning against the edge of the desk as I watched him. He didn't look up as he replied. "It's a collection of rituals, spells, incantations, the kind of stuff people turn to when they're desperate." "Desperate for what?" "Protection, power, answers. Take your pick." He paused, his finger tracing one of the intricate symbols inked onto the page. "This one's a binding ritual," he said quietly, "designed to trap a spirit or entity within a specific space." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you think Eleanor Blackwood performed it?" Jonny closed the book, his gaze meeting mine. "If she didn't, someone else did. And whatever they trapped, it's still here." The weight of his words settled heavily in the room, the silence thick and suffocating. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the reality of our situation sinking in. "What's our next move?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. Jonny set the book down, his expression resolute. "We find the source. If something was bound here, there has to be a focal point, a place where the ritual was performed. And if we find it, then we figure out what we're dealing with and how to stop it." Easier said than done, I thought, but I kept the comment to myself. Jonny's confidence was one of the few steadying forces in this house, and I wasn't about to undermine it. We left the study and began methodically searching the house, room by room. The shadows seemed to deepen as we moved, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing moment. It was as though the house itself was resisting our efforts, pushing back against our intrusion. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, we found a trunk filled with personal belongings, photographs, letters, and a small jewelry box. The photographs were faded, the faces barely recognizable, but one stood out. A portrait of Eleanor Blackwood, her dark eyes staring directly at the camera with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the years. Jonny studied the photo for a long moment before setting it aside. "She doesn't look like the type to scare easily," he said quietly. "No," I agreed, my gaze lingering on the image. "But something scared her enough to brick up every window in this house." We continued our search, the hours slipping by unnoticed as we delved deeper into the mysteries of Blackwood Manor. Every room seemed to hold a new piece of the puzzle. A cryptic note, a strange artifact, a faint stain on the floor that spoke of secrets better left buried. It wasn't until we reached the attic that we found what we were looking for. The space was cramped and cluttered, filled with old furniture, boxes, and a thick layer of dust that seemed to coat everything in sight. But in the center of the room, beneath a sheet of faded cloth, we discovered a large, intricately carved table. Jonny pulled the cloth away, revealing the table's surface, which was covered in strange symbols and markings that matched those we'd seen in the book. The air around it felt charged, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I stepped closer. "This is it," Jonny said, his voice low but certain. "This is where the ritual was performed." I swallowed hard, the weight of the discovery settling heavily in my chest. Whatever had happened in this house, it had started here, and it was far from over. The oppressive atmosphere of Blackwood Manor seemed to thicken in the hours after our discovery in the attic. The house's creaks and groans grew louder, almost purposeful, as though it were alive and resenting our intrusion. Even the air felt heavier, charged with an energy I could neither explain nor ignore. Jonny and I reconvened in the sitting room, the carved table fresh in both our minds. The faint light from a single oil lamp threw jagged shadows across the walls, playing tricks on my eyes. Or at least, that's what I told myself as I caught what I thought was a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Jonny, for his part, was quiet. He had a way of retreating into himself when piecing together the tangled threads of a mystery, letting his mind churn without interruption. I had learned long ago not to press him during these moments, but tonight, the silence felt almost unbearable. "What are you thinking?" I asked, my voice slicing through the stillness like a knife through taut fabric. He didn't look at me immediately, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of the lamp. "The ritual," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "Eleanor Blackwood went to great lengths to perform it. The bricked-up windows, the symbols, the artifacts. It wasn't done on a whim." I nodded, though his words left a knot of unease in my chest. And yet, whatever she was trying to bind is still here. Jonny's gaze met mine, the flicker of the lamp reflecting in his sharp eyes. Which means either she failed or she didn't account for something. Either way, the ritual was only the beginning. The weight of his words settled over us, heavy and inescapable. There was no denying that we were dealing with something far beyond the ordinary, and the more we uncovered, the more questions seemed to arise. Before we could delve further into the implications, a sudden, sharp noise echoed through the house, a loud, deliberate knock that seemed to reverberate through the very walls. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I glanced toward the source of the sound. It had come from the direction of the dining room, though the shadows made it impossible to see clearly from where we sat. Jonny was on his feet in an instant, his movements swift and purposeful as he reached for the lamp. I followed him closely, my heart pounding in my chest as we approached the darkened doorway that led to the dining room. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. The faint glow of the lamp illuminated the long, heavy table and the worn chairs that surrounded it, casting shadows that stretched and twisted across the walls. But then I saw it. A small, intricately carved box sitting in the center of the table. It was the same box we had found in the basement, though neither of us had brought it upstairs. "How?" I began, but Jonny cut me off with a sharp gesture, his eyes scanning the room with the intensity of a hawk. He approached the table cautiously, the lamp held high as he examined the box from all angles. "It's the same one," he confirmed, his voice tight. "But we left it downstairs," I said, my own voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to remain calm. Jonny nodded, his jaw tight as he reached for the box. His fingers brushed the surface, and for a moment, the air seemed to hum with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. He opened the box carefully, revealing its contents. A lock of dark hair tied with a faded ribbon, a silver key engraved with an intricate pattern, and a small piece of parchment covered in spidery handwriting. Jonny handed me the lamp and picked up the parchment, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the text. "Latin," he muttered, his tone both irritated and intrigued. "What does it say?" I asked, leaning closer to get a better look. He didn't answer immediately, his lips moving silently as he translated the text. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Bound by fear, unbroken by will, only truth unburied shall quiet the still. I frowned, the cryptic phrase swirling in my mind like a dark, unrelenting storm. What does it mean? Jonny set the parchment down, his expression grim. It's a riddle, he said simply. A key to whatever Eleanor Blackwood was trying to do or undo. The room seemed to grow colder with each passing moment, the faint hum of energy in the air pressing against my skin like a tangible weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though the shadows held no answers. Jonny closed the box and picked it up, his movements deliberate as he turned toward the door. "We need to check the basement again," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. I followed him without hesitation, though every step back into the depths of the house felt like a journey into the unknown. The basement door loomed ahead, its warped wood seeming almost alive in the flickering light of the lamp. Jonny pushed the door open, the familiar creak sending a shiver down my spine. The air inside was colder than before, biting and damp as we descended the narrow staircase. The basement was just as we'd left it, or so it seemed at first. The shelves of jars, the rotting wood, the scattered debris. It was all as I remembered, yet something felt different. The space seemed darker, more oppressive, as though the shadows had grown and taken on a life of their own. Jonny set the box on the floor near the center of the room, the faint hum of energy returning as he opened it once more. The lamp's glow flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls as he carefully placed the silver key and the parchment on the ground beside the box. "Now what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jonny didn't answer immediately, his focus trained on the items before him. "The key," he said finally. "It has to fit something in this house, something we haven't found yet." "But what?" "That's what we're going to figure out." He stood, his sharp gaze scanning the room once more. "Check the shelves," he instructed. "Look for anything that might be connected to the ritual or to Eleanor." I nodded, my hands trembling slightly as I began sorting through the jars and debris that lined the shelves. Most of it was useless, rotting fabric, rusted tools, broken glass. But one item caught my attention. A small, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of crumbling papers. "Jonny," I called, holding up the journal. He crossed the room quickly, his expression shifting to one of curiosity as he took the journal from my hands. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the handwritten text with the intensity of a man piecing together a puzzle. "It's hers," he said quietly. "Eleanor's journal." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, the significance of the discovery sinking in. Whatever secrets Eleanor Blackwood had taken to her grave, they were written here, waiting to be uncovered. Jonny and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken understanding passing between us like a silent pact. We were closer than ever to unraveling the truth of Blackwood Manor, but with each step forward, the shadows seemed to grow darker, the house itself bristling against our intrusion. As Jonny turned the pages of the journal, his brow furrowed in concentration, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable, a precipice that threatened to swallow us whole. The air around us seemed to hum with anticipation, as though the house itself was watching, waiting. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, bound by the same unrelenting pursuit of truth that had brought us here. The journal's leather binding was stiff under Jonny's grip as he flipped through its pages, the brittle parchment cracking faintly with each turn. We had relocated to the dining room, where the flickering lamplight created rippling shadows on the bricked-up windows. The oppressive silence of Blackwood Manor seemed louder here, broken only by the occasional scrape of Jonny's boot against the floor as he shifted his weight. "This woman was meticulous," Jonny muttered, his eyes scanning the slanted script that filled the pages. I leaned closer, catching fragments of Eleanor Blackwood's thoughts, snippets of a life consumed by fear and obsession. The handwriting was frantic in places, the ink smeared as if her hand had trembled while she wrote. "She was terrified," I said softly, the realization settling over me like a cold fog. Jonny nodded, his brow furrowing as he paused on a particular page. "She talks about it," he said, tapping the parchment. "Always vague, but it's clear she believed something was here, something she couldn't escape." I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around myself as I glanced toward the bricked-up windows. It was hard not to imagine Eleanor sitting where we were now, scribbling her fears into the journal as the walls seemed to close in around her. "What's that symbol?" I asked, pointing to a crudely drawn mark in the margin of the page. Jonny tilted the book toward the light, his eyes narrowing. "It looks like a seal," he said, "part of the ritual. She must have believed it would contain whatever she was dealing with." "Believed" being the operative word, I replied, unable to keep the skepticism from my tone. "If it worked, we wouldn't be here." Jonny didn't respond immediately, his focus returning to the journal. "It says the seal was placed in the house's heart." He looked up, meeting my gaze. "Any guesses where that might be?" "The attic," I offered, thinking of the ritual table we'd found there. Jonny shook his head. "Too obvious. The heart of a house is its foundation." "The basement," I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. Jonny nodded, closing the journal with a decisive snap. "Let's go." I followed him reluctantly as he grabbed the lamp and led the way down the creaking staircase to the basement door. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows stretching longer as if trying to swallow the faint light of the lamp. The basement smelled of damp earth and decay, the stench stronger now than it had been before. The faint hum of energy I'd noticed earlier was more pronounced, vibrating in my bones as we descended the narrow staircase. Jonny set the lamp on a wooden beam, its glow barely penetrating the gloom. He crouched near the center of the room, his fingers tracing the symbols carved into the dirt floor. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I crouched beside him, the faint light casting eerie shadows across his face. "What are we looking for?" "Anything out of place," he replied, his gaze sweeping the room. I began examining the shelves, my fingers brushing against jars of unidentifiable substances and tools caked in rust. Nothing stood out until I reached the far corner, where a loose brick protruded from the wall. "Jonny," I called, my voice shaking slightly as I gestured to the brick. He was at my side in an instant, his movements swift and purposeful. He set the lamp down and pulled out the brick, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small wooden box, its surface etched with the same symbols we'd seen throughout the house. Jonny opened the box carefully, revealing a piece of parchment covered in elaborate script. "It's another part of the ritual," he said, his voice tense. "What does it say?" "It's a binding spell," he replied, his eyes scanning the text. "But it's incomplete." I frowned, the implications sinking in. Eleanor never finished it. Jonny nodded grimly, closing the box and tucking it under his arm. That's why it didn't work. She tried to trap whatever was here, but she didn't have all the pieces. As we turned to leave, the air around us seemed to shift, growing heavier with each passing moment. The faint hum of energy had become a low, throbbing vibration, pressing against my skin like an unseen force. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Jonny nodded, his expression grim. "We need to get out of here." But as we ascended the stairs, the vibration grew stronger, accompanied by a faint whispering that seemed to echo from the very walls. I glanced back, half expecting to see a shadow moving in the darkness, but the basement remained empty. When we reached the main floor, I closed the door behind us, the whispers fading as if they'd been cut off by the barrier. My heart was pounding in my chest, the weight of what we discovered settling heavily in my mind. "What now?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to remain calm. Jonny set the box on the dining room table, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "We need to complete the spell," he said firmly. "You're serious?" He looked at me, his expression unwavering. "It's the only way to end this." I swallowed hard, the gravity of his words sinking in. Whatever Eleanor Blackwood had tried to bind, it was still here, lurking in the shadows of this house. And if we didn't stop it, we might not make it out alive. As Jonny began preparing the ritual, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the corners of my vision, and the faint hum of energy had returned, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight. For a moment, I wondered if we were making a mistake, if we were meddling in something far beyond our understanding. But as I looked at Jonny, his movements steady and deliberate as he laid out the pieces of the ritual, I felt a flicker of hope. If anyone could solve the mystery of Blackwood Manor, it was him, and I would stand by his side no matter what. The dining room felt like the eye of a storm, a fragile pocket of calm within the swirling chaos of Blackwood Manor. Jonny's deliberate movements carried an air of control, even as the house seemed to rebel around us. The flickering lamplight cast exaggerated shadows across the table, illuminating the delicate ritual components he had laid out. Eleanor's journal, the carved box, the silver key, and the parchment with its faded script. Jonny looked up from his work, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Are you ready for this?" I hesitated, not because I doubted his resolve, but because I wasn't sure what readiness even meant in this situation. My heart was a drumbeat of nerves, and the air in the room was so thick with tension that it felt as though the house itself were holding its breath. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said finally, forcing a small smile I didn't entirely feel. Jonny nodded, accepting my answer without question. He returned his attention to the items before him, his hands steady as he arranged them with the precision of a surgeon. Each movement was deliberate, a careful step toward whatever came next. The first words of the ritual came quietly, slipping from Jonny's lips like smoke into the air. The Latin phrases felt ancient, their cadence rhythmic and commanding, even though their meaning was lost on me. The house responded immediately. A low, almost imperceptible hum began to rise from the floorboards, vibrating in the soles of my boots. It wasn't the same as the energy I'd felt before. This was deeper, more resonant, as though the house were waking from a long, restless slumber. Jonny's voice grew stronger, more insistent, as he continued the incantation. I stood at his side, watching the symbols on the parchment begin to glow faintly in the dim light. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and the cold air seemed to press against my skin like a living thing. The first tangible shift came as the bricked-up windows began to moan, not with wind, but with a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the walls. It wasn't just noise. It was something alive, something ancient, something angry. "Jonny," my voice trembled despite my effort to keep it steady. He didn't stop, his focus unbroken as he moved to the next phase of the ritual. The silver key sat in the center of the table, its intricate engravings catching the flickering lamplight. With careful precision, Jonny placed the key on the parchment and pressed his hand over both. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the key began to glow. The light started faint, a pale, ethereal glow that pulsed gently in time with Jonny's words. But as the incantation built, so did the intensity of the light, growing brighter and sharper until it felt like the entire room was bathed in its glow. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct, like the rustle of leaves in a distant wind. But they grew louder with each passing second, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of anguish and anger. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, a chorus of the trapped and the forgotten. I pressed my hands to my ears instinctively, but it did little to block out the sound. The whispers weren't just in the room. They were in my head, slipping through the cracks in my defenses and filling my mind with fragments of pain and despair. "Focus, Evelyn." Jonny's voice cut through the noise like a lifeline, pulling me back to the present. I dropped my hands, forcing myself to concentrate on his voice. He was my anchor, the one steady thing in a world that felt like it was crumbling around me. The hum from the floorboards grew stronger, merging with the whispers in a symphony of chaos. The walls seemed to tremble, the shadows stretching and twisting as though alive. The bricked-up windows were no longer silent. They were screaming, their moans rising into an unholy wail that made my teeth ache. Jonny's voice rose above it all, the Latin words sharp and commanding as he completed the incantation. He picked up the silver key, its glow nearly blinding, and moved toward the far end of the room where the largest of the bricked-up windows loomed. "What are you doing?" I shouted over the noise, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ending this," he replied, his voice resolute. The key in his hand pulsed brighter as he approached the wall, the air around him shimmering with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He pressed the key against the bricks, the light exploding outward in a burst that left me momentarily blinded. When my vision cleared, the brick wall was gone. In its place was a gaping void, a yawning darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly into the unknown. The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt deafening. Jonny stood at the edge of the void, his silhouette framed by its infinite darkness. He turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "This is it," he said quietly. "The heart of the house." I stepped closer, the chill of the void pressing against my skin as I peered into its depths. It wasn't just darkness, it was something more, something alive. The air around it felt charged, humming with an energy that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jonny didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the void. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "We finish what Eleanor started." He stepped into the void without hesitation, his figure swallowed by the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him disappear, the void's presence pressing against me with an almost suffocating weight. For a moment, I hesitated, fear rooting me to the spot. But then I remembered Jonny's words. his unwavering belief that we could end this. With a deep breath, I stepped into the void after him. The darkness enveloped me immediately, its chill seeping into my skin as I stumbled forward. I couldn't see Jonny, couldn't hear him. The void was silent, its oppressive weight pressing against me from all sides. But then, faintly, I heard his voice. "Evelyn," he called, his tone steady and strong. I followed the sound, my steps uncertain but determined. The darkness seemed to shift around me, a living thing that pushed back against my progress. When I finally reached him, he was standing before a large, intricately carved seal embedded in the floor. The silver key rested in the center, glowing faintly. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. I nodded, the weight of the moment settling heavily in my chest. Together, we knelt before the seal, our hands reaching for the key as Jonny began the final words of the ritual. The void seemed to recoil, its darkness retreating as the seal began to glow brighter. The hum of energy grew stronger, rising into a crescendo that filled the air with an almost unbearable intensity. And then, with one final, blinding burst of light, the void was gone. We were back in the dining room, the oppressive weight of the house lifted. The bricked-up windows were open, the faint light of dawn spilling into the room. For the first time since we'd arrived at Blackwood Manor, the house was silent. The silence in Blackwood Manor was almost deafening. For the first time, it wasn't ominous or heavy. It was cleansing, like a deep breath after being submerged underwater for far too long. The bricked-up windows were no longer wounds sealed against the world. Instead, they allowed the first rays of dawn to pierce the walls, casting soft beams of light that felt warm and fragile, as though the house were testing the world again. I stood in the dining room, my legs unsteady beneath me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my hands still trembled, clutching the back of a chair as though it could anchor me to reality. The lingering sense of the void, the pressing darkness we had both ventured into, clung to my skin like a cold sweat. Jonny was standing across the room, his shoulders slightly hunched as he placed the silver key back into the carved box. He moved deliberately, almost reverently, his usually steady hands betraying a faint tremor. His face was pale, illuminated by the soft gold of the morning sun streaming through the now open window nearest him. "I didn't think it would work," I admitted quietly, my voice startling me in the stillness. Jonny turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. Despite the exhaustion etched into his features, there was a faint spark in his gaze, a determination that seemed undiminished even after everything we had faced. "It had to," he said simply, his voice calm but carrying an edge of weariness. I let out a shaky laugh, brushing the hair from my face with trembling fingers. "That's your answer to everything, isn't it?" He shrugged, his mouth twitching in the faintest hint of a smirk. "So far, it's gotten me this far." It was such a Jonny response that I couldn't help but smile, even as the weight of the past hours settled heavily on my chest. I stepped closer to him, my footsteps echoing faintly on the wooden floor. The carved box sat between us on the table, the silver key glinting faintly in the sunlight. "What now?" I asked softly, my voice carrying the question that had been looming in my mind since the moment the void vanished. Jonny didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the box as though it held answers we had yet to uncover. "Now," he said finally, "we make sure this never happens again." There was a finality in his tone that left no room for argument, and I nodded, my hands falling to my sides. For all the relief I felt at the house's silence, there was still an unease lingering at the edges of my mind, a shadow of the darkness that had consumed this place for so long. The sound of hesitant footsteps drew my attention to the doorway, and I turned to see Margaret Cooper standing there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide as they darted around the room, taking in the open windows and the faint morning light spilling across the floor. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and fear. Jonny met her gaze, his expression steady. "The house is free," he said simply. Margaret's shoulders sagged in relief, and her hands flew to her mouth as though to stifle a sob. She stepped into the room slowly, her movements cautious, as though she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "It feels different," she whispered, her eyes flicking toward the nearest window. "It should," I said, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "Whatever was here, it's gone now." Margaret nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't thank us just yet," Jonny replied, his tone dry but not unkind. "There's still work to be done." I shot him a look, but Margaret didn't seem to mind. She simply nodded again, her gaze drifting toward the sunlight streaming through the windows. Jonny straightened, slipping the silver key into his pocket before closing the carved box and tucking it under his arm. "We'll need to make a few calls," he said, his tone brisk as he turned toward me. "There's no guarantee this place will stay quiet if someone else decides to meddle with it." "I'll handle it," I replied, already pulling my notebook from my coat pocket. Margaret lingered for a moment longer before retreating back down the hallway, her footsteps soft against the creaking floorboards. The sound of her voice reached us faintly as she called for Thomas and Lucy, her tone carrying a warmth I hadn't heard before. Jonny and I stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything we had been through pressing down on us like a shared burden. The house was quiet now, its oppressive energy lifted, but there was no denying the toll it had taken on both of us. "You did good, Evelyn," Jonny said finally, his voice low but sincere. I blinked, caught off guard by the rare compliment. "I didn't do anything special," I said, brushing off his words with a faint smile. "You didn't run," he countered, his sharp gaze meeting mine. "That's more than most people would have done." I opened my mouth to reply, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded, letting his words settle over me like a fragile shield against the lingering doubts in my mind. Jonny turned toward the doorway, his steps steady as he moved toward the hallway. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "We've got work to do." I hesitated for a moment, my gaze lingering on the carved box resting in the crook of his arm. The mysteries of Blackwood Manor had been unraveled, but the threads of its story would remain with me long after we left this place. As I followed Jonny out of the dining room, the morning sunlight followed us, casting long, golden shadows that seemed to banish the last remnants of the darkness that had plagued this house. And for the first time since we had stepped through its doors, Blackwood Manor felt like just a house, a place of stone and wood, no longer haunted by the weight of its past. But as I passed the bricked-up window nearest the door, now open and bathed in sunlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us. Not with malice, but with quiet curiosity, as though it too were trying to make sense of the light that had finally returned to its halls. I paused in the doorway, my hand resting on the frame as I glanced back at the empty room. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced, but the memories of what we had faced here would remain. And as much as I wanted to believe that the house's story was over, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if its silence would last. Jonny's voice called to me from down the hallway, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned and stepped into the light, leaving the shadows of Blackwood Manor behind. For now, as we stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Blackwood Manor loomed behind us, stripped of the suffocating presence that had dominated it for so long. The light of the early sun bathed its stone facade, softening the edges that had once seemed so hostile. It was no longer a house that bled shadows, but for all its newfound stillness, the building carried the weight of its story, tangible like the remnants of a storm. Jonny carried the carved box under one arm, the silver key now tucked securely inside. The morning light didn't do much to soften the exhaustion etched into his features, his shoulders slightly more hunched than usual. I could feel the weight of his thoughts, though he kept them locked behind his familiar mask of quiet resolve. Margaret was standing at the edge of the garden with Lucy, who was threading together wildflowers with a steady, almost meditative focus. Thomas hovered nearby, his movements uncertain, like a man who didn't quite trust the peace around him. "You're really leaving?" Margaret's voice carried across the yard as we approached. There was no judgment in her tone, only quiet disbelief. "We've done everything we can," Jonny said, his tone even but firm. "The house is no longer dangerous, but it's still yours to decide what to do with." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes flicking toward the manor. "It feels different," she said, her voice tinged with wonder. "It should," I replied, glancing back at the house. "Whatever was here, it's been set free." Margaret's gaze lingered on me, her expression equal parts gratitude and uncertainty. "Will it come back?" Jonny hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "Not if you leave the past buried." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Margaret nodded again, her grip tightening on Lucy's shoulder as though to anchor herself to something solid. Jonny adjusted his grip on the box and turned toward the car parked at the edge of the drive. I followed, my steps heavy with the exhaustion of the past days. But as we reached the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. I turned back, my eyes scanning the facade of the house. The open windows stared back at me, their glass panes reflecting the soft light of the morning. They were just windows now, I told myself. Nothing more. But as I stared, a faint movement caught my eye, a flicker of shadow behind the 13th window. My breath caught, and for a moment, I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing. "Evelyn." Jonny's voice pulled me back, steady and grounding. I turned to see him watching me, his sharp eyes narrowed slightly. "You all right?" I hesitated, glancing back at the window. The shadow was gone, the glass reflecting only the pale blue of the sky. "Yeah," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Just saying goodbye." Jonny's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he nodded, his expression unreadable. He opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, the carved box resting on the seat beside him. I climbed into the passenger seat, the weight of the house's story pressing against my chest like a physical thing. As Jonny started the engine, the low hum of the car filled the silence between us, a small sound that felt enormous in the wake of everything we had faced. We drove in silence for a while, the manor shrinking in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely. The road stretched out before us, winding through the countryside like a ribbon of possibility. "You saw something?" Jonny said finally, his voice breaking the silence like the first crack of thunder before a storm. I glanced at him, startled by the certainty in his tone. "What makes you think that?" "You're quiet," he said simply. "Quieter than usual. And you keep looking back." I sighed, leaning back against the seat as I rubbed a hand over my face. "I thought I saw something," I admitted. "In the window. A shadow, maybe." Jonny didn't respond immediately, his hands steady on the wheel as he navigated the winding road. "And now, it's probably nothing," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Probably," Jonny agreed, though his tone carried a weight that left the word hanging in the air between us. I turned to look at him, studying the sharp lines of his profile in the morning light. "You don't think it's over, do you?" Jonny's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "It's over for now," he said finally. "But some stories don't stay buried." The words settled heavily in my chest, an acknowledgement of the unspoken truth we both understood. Blackwood Manor's silence might be a relief, but it was also a question left unanswered, a story unfinished. As the car sped down the empty road, the weight of that story stayed with me, a quiet reminder of the shadows we had left behind. The house might have been freed, but its history would linger, etched into its walls like a scar. And though we had stepped back into the light, the darkness of Blackwood Manor would always be waiting, just beyond the 13th window.